Okay, thanks for coming out, everybody, to our second lunch and learn of the term. They're a little more sporadic this year because we've got a bunch of workshops crammed in between. So our next lunch and learn won't actually be until after Thanksgiving, near the end of November. I'm going to talk about how not to break a microscope, so be a good one to attend. But a couple of quick announcements about what's happening between now and November. So next weekend is our tissue clearing workshop. So it's a 3-day event, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. There's going to be lectures in the morning, all 3 days. The schedule is posted on our website. Those lectures are open to anybody. Unfortunately, the hands-on stuff's all filled up. It's been filled up for a while. But if anyone's interested in any of the lectures, there's some good people coming from out of town for a couple of them as well. You're more than welcome to come and join for those. Okay? And then the 2 weeks after that is the new approaches of light microscopy workshop that's being held directly between us and the so that's an all-day lecture on Wednesday. It's an insane amount of lecture. It starts at 9 in the morning, goes till 6 in the afternoon. But it's a lot of, let's say, more niche microscopy techniques, so stuff like you're not going to see in the HCBI, but it might be really interesting for you. It might have an application to your specific project. So definitely take a look at that. I believe to sign up for the lectures is free, and then a lot of the companies, there's a lot of small microscopy companies that are bringing in equipment. You can demo that equipment on the Thursday and the Friday, and you get to pay a little bit extra for that. So again, there's a link from our website as well. Alright, so that's what's going to kind of be going on for the next couple weeks. And there's Thanksgiving, and then after Thanksgiving, we'll be back here for the last one. Alright, cool. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sven, who's going to tell us all about deconvolution.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, a little bit more about deconvolution today. The presentation itself will be filled with really a lot of details because I also want to hand it out to anyone who is interested in it. I have really detailed a lot of the parameters for those that want to use it. I'm not necessarily going into that much detail during the talk itself, but you can always use it afterwards. So deconvolution, many of you might have already heard of it, especially now that at CBI we have the new cell discover, which is a white field system. Deconvolution can come in really handy to do optical sectioning, but I hope to introduce you to also to deconvolution of focal images to focal images, etc., and show you how it can also be of interest there. So first of all, a little bit about the history of deconvolution. It was not invented because of microscopy. Actually, deconvolution was invented for radio waves. As we know, radio waves as well as light, as well as X-rays, etc., they're all fitting into the complete electromagnetic spectrum. And as I mentioned, initially, deconvolution was used for the radio waves to actually clear out signal that we were receiving. From there, it went into astronomy, and as you can see, also to improve astronomy images to get much more detail of those star systems and stars that are far away. But since it is so far away, these objects are actually not that prone to lots of convolution, and they only need to apply a one-dimensional deconvolution algorithm to improve the image quality, because it's really far away. The difference with microscopy is that everything in the microscope is very close, and the convolution or the distortion that occurs is not just in one dimension, it's in all 3 dimensions, and we have to cover for that as well. Hence, they started off with the one-dimensional deconvolution algorithms, very mathematical solution, but then they changed it to also be able to apply it in all 3 dimensions. One of the first that worked a lot on it was, for example, Richardson. It's 80 family, I mean, it's a very famous family, so who knows. Another person was Lucy Leon. Both of them kind of invented the same algorithm. That's why it's called the Richardson-Lucy algorithm. In the meantime, there are more. But yeah, that's a little bit about the history there. Now, in an overview of this talk, what are we going to talk about? First of all, the diffraction limit, but especially the point spread function, to show why we need the deconvolution. Then some restoration results, and we're also going to discuss different systems and different settings. There's also a bunch of different algorithms available. Nearest neighbor, we have fast iterative, there's constraint iterative, etc. And also some settings, and it's especially these general settings that could go into very detailed. So there I would say, if you're interested in it, I can always provide you a copy of the presentation. So what's actually happening in a microscope is every image that we see in a microscope is distorted. If you look at a very small sphere in 3D, in reality it's a small sphere. This is how it would look like in a microscope. On the bottom image you see still a circle. The circle has these rings around it, so the light is distorted. But especially in Z, which is the top image and the right image, you see that the distortion is not only spread out a lot, but it's really made much longer, and you have side, the photons are sent to the side of this small sphere, etc. So we want to go back from this distorted image to our original sphere, and that's something that can be done mathematically with deconvolution software. Now the distortion, or it's also called convolution, that's actually an operation occurring in the microscope. We have our object, then we have the so-called PSF, that's the distortion, and kind of the multiplication of both gives us our real image, our distorted image. The inverse of that process, that's what we call the deconvolution. Now, as you can see here, we have our object, we have our PSF, which is the distortion, and then we have our image, three variables. Simple mathematics tells us that if you have the image and you know the result, if you have the image and you know the distortion, the PSF, you can calculate the original image back from it. And that's especially what we're going to do mathematically. So here you can see the PSF, which can be defined theoretically. We can estimate PSF for a certain objective in a certain microscope. So we can kind of calculate how the distortion probably is going to happen. But that PSF, theoretical PSF, will always be nicely symmetrical in all dimensions, x and y, and stretched out in z, but still symmetrical top versus bottom of the PSF distortion of this small sphere. In most cases, however, an experimental PSF will give you much better results. So here you see the distortion. Distortion occurs, as I mentioned, in x and y, but in z it's much worse. This would be a theoretical distortion. As you can see nicely, the top and the bottom are symmetrical, as well as the left and the right. The distortion here on the right side, this is an experimentally defined distortion. Experimentally defined by imaging small round beads. And I will come back to that. But here you see that the distortion to the bottom of the bead is very different than the one to the top. That's also why if you apply this distortion, which can be calculated with the ZEN software, to your image, the result, the final result of the image when using this PSF will be much nicer than using this. However, the theoretical PSF will already give a very nice approach in the end. Some point spread functions defined with beads on different kinds of microscopes. So here, for example, you see beads in water. You see the spherical aberration here on the right side. Here you see a bead acquired with a confocal microscope, and you see that the distortion on the bottom is more than on the top, but it's also a little bit tilted. Here you see the distortion of the PSF acquired of beads with a line scanner. It's one of the worst PSFs that one can have. And here you see another type of distortion because of an objective, the objective itself, which is not perfectly made. And you see that it's not only tilted, it's also extremely elongated. And you also have this small comma on the bottom going to the left bottom. So this is something that you cannot cover with a regular theoretical PSF. It's impossible to estimate that this would happen to your objective. And that's why it's always best to define PSF experimentally. Now, the theoretical PSF model is defined with a lot of parameters which are already present or known by the moment you acquire the image. Because with the ZEN software, all these parameters are automatically saved in the metadata of the file, the CZI file. First of all, you have the scaling, you have the magnification, the numerical aperture, type of lens plus, an epiplan, neofluor, or planapochromat, whatever, which excitation and emission wavelength you've been using, the type of microscope, the refractive index of the embedding media, if known. All these things have an effect on the final PSF, which you will have, the final distortion of the microscope. Now, I do admit that measuring a PSF can be a bit cumbersome, but it's definitely worth it. You also have to make sure to use fresh beads so that you have a very good signal to noise to define the distortion. Noisy images will always affect the PSF determination by the ZEN software, and might also affect the final result when applying deconvolution to your image. Now, the easiest way to define this PSF distortion of your microscope is by using tetraspec beads. Tetraspec beads are beads provided by, for example, Invitrogen, and they have actually 4 colors. One bead has 4 colors, blue, green, red, or far red. So when illuminated with all 4 channels sequentially, and you require a small Z stack, you can nicely see the distortion per color. And you can also compare the colors, because you will see that the distortion of the blue light is different than the green and the red and the far red light. So this is good in 2 ways. One, you have the PSF to provide the deconvolution, but 2, you also know whether there is a shift or not between the different channels. And then afterwards you can apply an anti-shift also with the software, so that you can really do very nice localization analysis as well. Now there's a whole protocol on how to do this, how to define the experimental model. Not going into much detail here, but basically what's very important is to have a very good signal to noise, and you acquire a Z-stack of the beads over sample. So when you click in the software on the optimal button in the Z-stack to acquire your step size, to define your step size to acquire the Z-stack, you're going to overrule the value that's given, and you're going to halve that value even more. So for example, if my step size is 500 micrometer or 500 nanometer, you're going to overrule it and say that the step size is going to be 250 nanometer or even smaller. You don't have to go like 8 times smaller either, that's not much use, but half is definitely something I can strongly adjust. You acquire the Z-stack of the beads in all 4 different colors, and then via the ZEN software we can then define the PSF for each of the channels. This is something that Doug and I can also help with if necessary. So after we acquire the image, we're going to do a bead averaging in the software, which means we have hundreds of beads in our image laying far enough apart from each other. We're going to calculate the average distortion, the average bead distortion based on those 100 beads. And from there, we're going to PSF determination. Now, as I mentioned, the final result of doing deconvolution with an experimental PSF can be very different from a theoretical model. Also, it's important if you have multiple dyes, that you can also apply different experimental PSFs to each of the channels. So that's why the tetraspeculates are very important. Now, once PSF has been determined in the ZEN software as well, below your PSF image, it will also tell you what the estimated resolution is that you can get with that system, with that certain magnification and lateral aperture. So you get a lateral resolution and you can also get an axial resolution. Now, a PSF can also be viewed in 3 different ways in the software. This is a little bit more advanced, but you can just look at the PSF distribution in XZ or YZ. You can also look at the optical transfer function, or there's also a slice optical transfer function. Now, the optical transfer function, this is nice to show, is actually showing you kind of the, this is shown in XZ, I have to mention that. It's showing you kind of the resolution that you can expect. The center has the low frequency values, which means big white or black fields. The more you go to the side, you see more and more the high resolution details in your image. So if you have some pixels here, that means that there are some really high resolution details in your image. Everything here in the center would be very low resolution frequency. As I mentioned, it's quite detailed. But what's very important is you see X and you see Z. You see here this gap in Z, and that's the missing color. So there is no real high resolution known in Z. And this will be very important for later on. This image comes from a regular white resolution. That's something you have to remember for later on. Now, when do you use deconvolution? It's really very applicable for thin monolayer cell cultures. Yeast, everything that's thin up until 10, 20, maybe 40 micrometers. Fish signal in nuclei can be really brought up much nicer, can see much more detail there. Finding these finds for the neurobiologist among us. And etc. So it's really much more for thinner sections or monolayer cell cultures. It's not really applicable for very thick specimen where you would typically go for tissue clearing and then go to the light sheet or, for example, to the two-photon microscope. Deconvolution does not invent structures. That's a very important message. However, it is possible that artifacts appear because of over-deconvolving or over-applying certain parameters. But that's something you have to keep in mind, and that's something you also always have to compare your end result with your original result. In ZEN, this is pretty easy. You can just use the splitter document. If you deconvolve an image, you never deconvolve over the one that's open. You always create a new document. So you can immediately compare your original with deconvolved image. Now, just to give an overview, where can I use deconvolution? Most commonly used would be 3D wide field fluorescence. We want to improve our wide field image. We actually want to get an optical section image from our wide field image, just as what we do with the confocal microscope, the spinning disk, a two-photon microscope, or the light sheet. Deconvolution is a valid optical sectioning method. As I mentioned, deconvolution is based on mathematics, a confocal is based on optics, and then you have in between structured illumination, which would be our apotome, for example. Apotome combines mathematics and optics, but all 3 of them are valid optical sectioning methods. Now, I was talking about this missing code before. In Z, we do not have high resolution information in a wide field image. However, when you acquire multiple Z stacks with, for example, a confocal microscope, and I'm moving here through the Z, each Z-plane will fill up more and more the missing cone of the previous Z-plane. And because of filling up this missing cone, you can further deconvolve the Z resolution as well of your already optically sectioned acquired images. So this means that images acquired with the epitome or acquired with the two-photon or the confocal microscope can still be further deconvolved and give you also higher Z resolution than initially acquired. So that's why it's also worth to look at your confocal images and still further deconvolve them. And not only apply deconvolution on wide field images. So here, for example, you see this is the raw data wide field image acquired with the epitome. This is just for wide field representation. You see here on top, this is the X. Y, this is the XZ view of spheres. In XZ, the sphere is really looking like an egg, and it's also, the image itself is blurred. Now, if we acquire the image with, if we apply deconvolution to that image, we see that the blurring is going away, but still our Z resolution is the same as what we had before. That's because we deconvolve a wide field image, we improve, we denoise the image with the deconvolution, but we also improve the resolution and the restoration of the light, which was spread out in this haziness. We now deconvolve it, we get a much higher signal to noise, we get a much better contrast, we get a bit higher resolution in X and Y, but we don't really get a higher resolution in Z. Now, if you apply the epitome for acquisition, you're really going to do optical section with the epitome directly. You see that this sphere here, in X, Y, in Z, it's also becoming a little bit much more like what's visible in X and Y. It's more spherical. It's much less of an egg. This is just simple epitome by itself section. If you then further deconvolve the section already, you also improve the Z resolution. You get much more closer to this real sphere, and you also improve the resolution in Z. Now, what's interesting to see here, and that's something you didn't see before, if I go back, here it's hardly visible. Here on this image, it's visible. You see, it looks like some planes are a little bit shifted. And this is due to vibrations of the system while the image was being acquired. This is something that was not visible before, but only after deconvolution of the epitome image it became visible that there were some vibrations ongoing on the system. Now, there are many algorithms in ZEN software. There are 5 algorithms implemented. We have the nearest neighbor, we have the inverse filter, fast iterative according to Meinl, fast iterative according to the Richards and Lucy method, and then there's also the constraint iterative. A small table to show when to use what, or what all the effects are. Not going too much into detail, but what is very important is the noise in your image. To a certain extent, you can compensate for the noise that's in your image. By the way, every image that you acquire is noisy. Whether it's a camera, whether it's a confocal or two-photon, whatever, there's always noise there. Maybe one is much more visible than the other, but it's always noisy. Now, in the deconvolution settings, you have something called strength. And strength is something that can be set automatic. It will actually try to define the level of noise versus the signal. But you can manually override it, and you can set it to strong, which means I'm going to have a weak restoration, and you can have really too much of deconvolution, or you can set it to weak, where you don't have that much deconvolution applied. You have a strong restoration of the signal. It's a little bit the inverse. What's more important, though, is whether you want to perform a clip or an automatic set. The clip will cut off the 0 value. The automatic will shift your display according to the calculations. So because of deconvolution, it is possible to have some negative values that are calculated. With automatic, this means that those negative values are discarded and your pixel values, your intensities that are measured, cannot really be compared anymore with one another. So this means if you use automatic setting, you should not apply or perform an intensity analysis on your images. If you really want to do image analysis afterwards, you should normalize according to clip. Then it's always done in the correct manner. It becomes one. We can also cover for bleaching. So when you acquire a Z stack, you're always illuminating the complete Z. So while you move through the Z stack, you might be bleaching the other layers already. So that's something that can be compensated for. A little bit less important nowadays with all the LEDs, but we can also compensate for lamp flickering with the old lamps tend to flicker, and you could actually see brighter Z planes in your whole Z stack, and then darker again and brighter again just because the lamp was flickering. We can also compensate for background correction in the deconvolution module itself. Background correction means that if you have a larger faint background, you can actually bring it down to get a darker background and get a better signal to most of your sample itself. Now here you can see an example of this decay correction or the bleaching correction. This is the original white field image. If I now deconvolve with the default settings, I might get some ringing around it. I don't know if you see it well on the screen, but you get some ringing around it because of the high background. And we can also see here some striping occurring. This might be because of lamp flickering in the XZ part. And there might also be some fluorescence decay or bleaching on board. Now if I enable this decay, this bleaching, I get a much better signal to noise there, and my deconvolution can be applied much better. I can also get rid of all this ringing occurring because of the background. So these are parameters you have to keep in mind. Always prepare your sample and always prepare your image before you go and do deconvolution. Look at your image, define whether you might have some bleaching or not, define whether you have a large homogeneous background or not. Try to get rid of it. Furthermore, we also have the conversion graph showing. So once you start running the deconvolution, this graph will show you the improvement. So the more the graph is going to the bottom, to the limit of 0, the more we are still improving our image. We are running iterations and we're running deconvolution over and over and over again. So the more it's going down, the better it's improving. And at a certain moment, it will just stop because improvement is done. If, however, you see this graph going up, that means that you're over-processing. And the moment that it starts going up, that's where you should stop the number of iterations. Typically, for constraint iterative, we use 40 iterations. Sometimes you might want to adjust it to like 20 iterations. You can also deconvolve differently for different channels. So it's not like I have 3 channels, I have to apply all the same parameters to my deconvolution. No, you can make different settings for different channels. Then the 4 or the 5, one is a little bit hidden methods. You have nearest neighbor, regularized inverse filter, fast iterative, and constraint. Nearest neighbor is the fastest, most simplest. It's basically you click on the button and it's done. It's really fast. It just removes out the focus line of the Z plane based on the planes above and below. Regularized inverse filter is a much more general deconvolution. It already uses Fourier transformation to go much deeper into the deconvolution itself. It defines the noise level, which is very important. And it also automatically sets your restoration strength. So regularized inverse filter is a good, it's still fast, it's not the best you can get, but it's a good way to see whether your image would improve dramatically or not at all from running deconvolution. Fast iterative and constraint iterative, they're a little bit more alike. Fast iterative is an algorithm, typically the one from Lucy Richardson is used, which can run very fast, but you need 500 to even 2,000 iterations. You have to repeat it very often. Constraint iterative is a much more profound deconvolution. It goes much deeper, looks much further into the details of the image file. Will also typically give you the best results, but it's also the heaviest calculations. So constraint iterative will also take the longest time to calculate something. Fast iterative will be faster. Regularized inverse filter will be the second fast. Nearest neighbor will be the fastest. This one you usually will, I don't think you will ever use. Regularized inverse filter, as I said, it's good to have an idea. I would suggest in most of the cases to just use constraint iterative. Fast iterative is very prone to noise, so that's something you have to be careful about. Now some examples of deconvolution. Here you see a wide field image of a neuron. This is just a regular wide field, X, Z, and YZ, looking from the side, and you see it's fairly thick. The Z resolution is stretched out a lot. I don't have much detail. I still have lots of autofocus line, which is normal. Then the nearest neighbor, you can hardly see it jump. You see a little bit improvement in the contrast. That's about it. Then we go to the regularized inverse filter. And here you can already see a slight improvement in the resolution, but you might have artifacts in the background occurring, etc., etc. But you see that there is improvement ongoing, so I can definitely use my deconvolution. You also see that the Z resolution is already slightly improving as well. Then when I go to fast iterative, here I have a really good improvement. My contrast is much higher, my resolution has been improved, I have a very good restoration. The average intensity is going up because of restoring the light that was spread out due to the convolution. But then constraint iterative, when I switch back and forward, look at the Z thickness here. You see I have a much better restoration of my Z. I have a much higher resolution of the Z here, plus also very fine details in the background here will be shown much better. So constraint iterative will definitely improve my image in the best manner. Now, some parameters that I think are important for regularization. One that's very important is I typically use first order or even second order. This is to compensate for noise in your images. As I mentioned, nearly all of the images are noisy that you see. So just apply first order. Calculations take a little bit longer, but you will enjoy the result much more than just using the zero order. Then there's a lot of other parameters, like the likelihood. How am I going to calculate, how am I going to look for the noise in there? We have the regularization, where total variation is looking really deep into every single detail of your image. Calculations can take very long. Then this conversion curve has to compare with something. Typically, it will always compare the result to the first image that you have. And again, the result of the first image. If it composes again, it looks at the first image. Do I have improvement or not? That's called the input image, compared to the input image. You can actually also compare to the average of the output of the input image, which makes, or the last output image. Sorry. Last output image can be dangerous because it improves. You have a new result, then it improves again, and you compare to this last result. if this last result was not good, the system cannot really know whether it's improved or not. Then we also have a setting for the maximum iterations and the quality threshold. Come back to that soon. For the constraint iterative though, we can look at Poisson or Gaussian distribution. Typically, all our images that we are looking at in microscopy should be based on the Poisson. This is where you have kind of a normal signal-to-noise distribution. If you have very high detector noise, you can use Gaussian distribution. Also here, first order and optimize is just typical analytical. These are just settings in the algorithms. This is very mathematical. Line search is one that I use. Also, will show it later on. It's one that I use when I have very noisy, very sparse data, and I really have to look, or the software really has to look for very small PSFs sparsely distributed in the image. For example, with photon count images. And there's also some settings for the fast and the constraint iterative. For Lucy Richardson, set the quality threshold to 0.1 or even 0%. So as soon as the difference in quality between the newly calculated image versus the one that you set, the input image, is below 0.1% or 0%, then we'll stop. For constraint iterative, typically we set it to 1% and then we stop. Sometimes even to 0.1% as well. Now what's fun is the GPU acceleration. Deconvolution is something that already exists very, very long, but has not really been applied. Because calculations of, for example, a 60-plane Z-stack in 4 colors, with each image about 1.3 million pixels, could take up to hours, if not even days, to calculate the final result. That's just because the calculations are really heavy and computers couldn't handle it that well. Nowadays we can use graphic cards and we can really accelerate due to parallelization for the calculations. And the GPU acceleration can really speed up your deconvolution processing 20 to even 80 times as compared to a regular CPU deconvolution. At the facility currently there's 2 computers that have GPU deconvolution. We hope to have more in the future. Very large images will automatically undergo a so-called GPU tiling. There the images will be split in different smaller images and then decomposed separately and afterwards stitched together again. Next to the regular deconvolution tab, where you have all the settings I just went over, you also have a PSF tab. And in the PSF tab are all the parameters according to your microscope or your excitation and emission wavelength, your nomenclature, which refractive index, median value, etc. These can also be overridden, and you can manually add it or adjust it. And that's very important, one, if you want to do 2-photon deconvolution, or if you are using different reflective indexes, then are automatically detected. Some list in detail, I'm not going into these details here. You can, for example, set a different immersion oil or a different medium that you'll be using. Also very important, whether you have an objective with a phase ring or not, the PSF generation, this is really mathematical scalar or vector. I don't even know the very details of that either. How your Z-stack was acquired. Again, one of those slides that I mentioned with lots of details, not going into, but what's very important, for example, here could be the cover slip. If you know the thickness of the cover slip can now be defined precisely with the cell discoverer, you can add it and you can have an even better PSF calculation when using a theoretical method. Now there's also something else which is called depth variance. And to show depth variance, I actually have to start with this image, which is a cell, and this is the white field image, just a single neural cell, astrocyte, sorry, with lots of mismatch in the refractive index. You see lots of distortion. The cell in Z looks almost like a pyramid. Now if I just use the default parameters, I already have very good signal to noise improvement, but I still have this very weird pyramid shape of my cell in XZ and YZ. If I then also apply a background correction and a decay or a bleaching correction, I even further improve my image, but still I have this very weird shape. And you can nicely see here where the cell is attached to the bottom of the glass. Here as well. Now if I then enable also the refractive index or the aberration correction, there's already a bit of improvement in X, Y, Z. So I'm really stepping away now from this completely weird pyramidal structure to something that looks biologically more correct. Just thanks to enabling this correction for the refractive index. But since we are having something in 3D, the PSF that we defined of a bead laying close to the glass is not the same PSF as the one defined by a bead laying further away from the glass. So that means that throughout the cell on different levels, I actually have different PSFs. My distortion in X and Y will be the same, but my Z will be stretched out longer and longer the more I step away from my cover slip. The deeper I go into my sample, the more my PSF is stretched out. This is something you can also correct with in the ZEN software. However, it's nearly impossible to acquire these PSFs in an experimental way, so you can never define precisely where the bead is in depth. But we can do it theoretically. And for, in this case, 10 different depths, we can theoretically define 10 different PSFs and apply it to our image. This is the so-called depth variance. So here I entered that I have 10 PSFs. I measured, when I go back to my original image, I measured the distance of the bottom to the cover slip, just 9 micrometers. I know my cover slip type and thickness. Now when I apply these settings to the deconvolution, you get a much better restoration. So this is deconvolved with constraint iterative. I am correcting for the aberration, but I'm also applying this depth variance. And you see that now my cell has a much more normal biological structure than the nice pyramid I had in the beginning. And my restoration is also much better. Just to compare, this is where we started off with, this is what we got in the end. So deconvolution is not necessarily something very straightforward. You might have to search a little bit for the best parameters and best options, but it can definitely really improve your image quality in the end. There's two ways to do deconvolution in ZEN. One is the easy deconvolution. You just have 4 buttons, simple, better, good, and excellent, applying respectively the nearest neighbor, the regularized inverse, the fast iterative, and the constraint iterative. Default settings, default parameters are applied to your image. In most cases, it actually might already give you a nice result as well. However, if you want to go deeper into it and your specimen or your acquisition is very noisy, your specimen is strange, your refractive index mismatch is large, there's also the advanced deconvolution where you can change all the parameters I've briefly discussed. This is also the one that you want to use for GPU deconvolution when you have measured PSF or experimental PSF, when you want to apply apotome deconvolution, deconvolution to your epitome images, etc. Now, how do I optimize my image during acquisition to go for deconvolution? First of all, always aim for oversampling in both X, Y, and Z. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, always oversample when acquiring or when defining the Z stack. But also your pixel size itself has to be small enough for the deconvolution. On a confocal microscope, it's fairly easy to set. You just click on optimal for the frame size, and it will be automatically applying the 2x Nyquist, which is sufficient for the deconvolution. On a camera-based system, however, it's not always as straightforward because the camera has a fixed size of pixels, it has a fixed number of pixels on the chip, and that's why next to the cell discoverer, for example, you will now find a table as well telling you in green which is good sampling, and marked in yellow which is actually oversampling or perfect sampling to run deconvolution. And from that table you can immediately read which camera to use together with which objective and which magnifying objective. So there's options there. The green will work for deconvolution. Keep in mind the yellow will give even better results. Also try to reduce electronic noise. It's not 100% correct, but acquire with a longer exposure time, so you average out the noise a little bit of the camera. For a confocal microscope, lower the gain, because the gain is what gives a voltage to the detector. The higher the voltage, the more noise you might generate. So lower the gain, increase the laser power if possible, and scan slower, so you also average out noise there. For camera images, there's also a method in ZEN, in the processing tab, which is called single pixel filter. And the single pixel filter will very nicely remove the noise that you have in the camera because of electronic noise. Other things you can do before running the deconvolution: check if you benefit from processing your images first with the stack correction. Stack correction offers you a couple of parameters to, like, background and decay. You have a bit more control over the background and the decay parameters than you have in the deconvolution module. So maybe first process it here. The background mode will reduce the noise. The decay will look through the Z-stack and cover for this bleaching in the Z-stack in a much more profound, or I would even say better way than the decay in the deconvolution module window itself. And as mentioned, flickering is less required nowadays. We all work with LEDs, but if a metal halide or a mercury lamp is used, always check if flickering was on low and put a cover for it, and it will affect the deconvolution results a lot if it's occurring. Background subtraction. There's also a method only for background subtraction, which is working even more profound. This really removes a smooth background or corrects for uneven illumination. And in the end, what you will end up with is a better signal-to-noise image. Better signal-to-noise means if I deconvolve it, I will also get better results. Most important value here is the radius. Always make this value larger than the radius of the largest non-background object. You will see it once you're working with it, what's meant with that. Now, the result here is similar to the background parameter in stack correction, somehow even to the one in the deconvolution module, but you have, again, more controllable functionality. So, something to also look. And then some examples, and next to the examples, for those that want the presentation, there's also some settings which I would advise. It's not applicable to any of the images all the time, but it would be, let's say, like 80% of the cases or 90% of the cases. These parameters will give you good results. This is for a regular wide field image. What's important there is here this first order. The camera is also noisy. automatic typically, but you also start with a good signal to noise. Typically, so you can use a strong restoration as well. Constraint iterative, and we're going to use 40 iterations. Now then, confocal images. Confocal images are typically very noisy, and when you zoom in at them, you will also see that the labeling or the pixels can be rather sparse. After deconvolution, you see this small insert here. This is deconvolve. This is not deconvolve. After deconvolution, you will get rid of this noise in your images, because deconvolution also has a denoising effect. But you also have a restoration of signal, and you will really have a much smoother image, a much nicer image after deconvolution of your confocal images. However, it's always required to apply a Z-stack, small Z-stack, sometimes even 3 planes is more than sufficient. What's very important here is, again, your strength. Now this is very noisy, so I'm going to put the strength a little bit lower, but I'm also going to use constraint iterative based on Poisson, first order to look for the noise and for iterations. To photon imaging, that's something you have to override. You can use the same parameters as before, but you have to override the PSF settings here below that you're using a multiphoton microscope. And you also have to manually type in your excitation, because that's something that cannot be read out currently automatically. So you click here on override, then you choose conventional microscope on top, and on the bottom you select multiphoton microscope. And then as fourth part you fill in the excitation wavelength. Also, as for regular confocal imaging, a slightly lower restoration strength because of the noise. But as you can see here, this is rather sparse. Also here the deconvolution can nicely restore the data. So if it is sparse, instead of using first input, there's also something called like mean of input. Mean of input will really look for very sparsely labeled samples. It will look for PSFs and try to reconstruct PSFs in between. And that's why from very noisy data you can still have a very nice restoration. So this mean of input is actually a very powerful parameter to use. Oh. Here on the bottom, if it's sparse, and you typically also have even more noise than with regular focal microscope, you can use the second order to look even more for the noise and compensate for the higher noise levels there as well. Then we also have the photon counting mode. Photon counting mode on a confocal microscope is used when you have really very, very faint signal. For those microscopes that are not equipped with AIR scan detector, you can use photon counting mode. The photon counting mode typically ends up in extremely noisy and extremely sparse labeling or sparse image. But the deconvolution, thanks to using this mean of input, only 4 iterations, and very strongly looking for all the noise in there, you can still have a very nice restoration of the data as well. And then extremely useful when setting all those parameters in the deconvolution window. When you look at the output window on the bottom, there's a button called preview. When you click preview, that's when the small insert window appears in your original image, and the deconvolution is immediately applied in this small insert. Since it's a very small region of interest and not a complete image, the calculations also occur much faster, and we can almost on the fly change the parameters and see the results in the insert. Once you find the good parameters and you have a very nice result, That's when you can apply these settings to the complete image and have deconvolution going forward. And with this preview, I would like to end the talk. If someone has questions, please go ahead. You can also discuss it afterwards. You can discuss it at CBI with Gunnar and me. And as I mentioned, you can have a copy of the talk for all these different settings and parameters if it's of interest. Thank you.